All right, so today we're going to continue multiplying integers. And remember, an integer is a whole number and its opposite, also the number 0, which is neither positive nor negative. So we're going to start out with this word problem about parachute, and we're going to use what we know about integers to solve this problem. Once a parachute is deployed, that means opened. So once the parachute is deployed, here's my parachute, and this is the little guy on the parachute. Well, no. So once it's deployed, the person will descend, which means drop, at about 5 meters per second. Where will the skydiver be in relation to the parachute after 4 seconds? Okay, so what integer should be used to represent the position of the skydiver after 1 second? So is that going to be a positive 5 meters or a negative 5 meters? Go ahead and answer that question. Now the answer is negative. It's going to be a negative 5 meters because at the point in which he deployed, that's 0. He had not moved at all. But after 1 second, he has already dropped 5 meters because it's 5 meters per second. The repeated addition expression is -5 plus -5 plus -5 plus -5. And you'll notice there are 4 groups of -5. So what is the sum going to be? Go ahead and answer that question. If we repeatedly add the number of 5 4 times, the sum will be 20 meters. Okay, so what is a skydiver's position after 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds? So what is it after 2 seconds? Go ahead and answer that. It's -10. What about 3 seconds? What will that be? Answer that question. -15. What about 4 seconds? What's that going to be? -20. Okay, so the next thing it's going to ask you is to write a multiplication sentence that represents the skydiver after 4 seconds. So remember that the multiplication symbol actually means equal groups of, and that's something we learned in 3rd grade, but after a while we kind of forget that. So it means equal groups, well, that's weird. It means equal groups of. All right, so what is that going to be? Go ahead and write that multiplication expression. That's right, it's going to be 4 groups of -5, and the answer is going to be -20. Now it's asking you for an extra piece of information, so using the same thought process we figured out the previous multiplication sentence, if he were to drop 5 seconds, where would he be then? So go ahead and write a multiplication sentence for that. So 5 groups of seconds times -5 meters per second is going to equal -25 meters. All right, so let's do some more practice. So here's a good summary of what we learned yesterday and what we're applying today. The key concept is that when you multiply integers with different signs, so remember when we put a number right next to something in parentheses, that's actually multiplication because we're very soon going to be doing algebra equations and we need to get away from using the multiplication symbol that looks like a letter X. So 6 times -4 is equal to -24. A positive times a negative equals a negative answer. But if we have -5 groups times +7 groups, the answer is negative. So different signs, the product will always be negative. So the model below shows the example. Now we've been using counters, but you can also do this on a number line. So you can see in this model, we have 4 groups of -3. 1 group of -3, 1 group of -3, 1 group of -3, 1 group of -3. So you can see that actual number line looks like the repeated addition sentence of -3 plus -3 plus -3 plus -3, and where you're going to land will be -12. So 4 groups of -3 is definitely going to be -12. Okay. Now, if we come down here to the next example, you could see the same thing happening. So we have 3 groups of -5, -5, -5, -5. We're going to land on -15. So that actually makes sense. The next key concept is that when you multiply integers that have the same sign, the answer will always be positive. So we saw this yesterday. +2 times a +6. 2 groups of 6 equals 12. 6 plus 6. -10 groups. So if you subtract -10 groups of -6, if you take away all the -6 groups from the 0 pairs that we modeled yesterday, you're only going to be left with the positive, so the answer is going to be +60. So let's see some examples of that. Okay, so let's look at this closely, because this might seem a little confusing originally, but it kind of pulls together all the ideas we've been talking about. So if you look at this number line, it matches these thoughts right here. So a positive times a negative. So if we have 2 groups of -3, that's -6. So we have 1 group of negative, whoops, I need to turn my pen on. Really? So if I have 1 group of -3, that's -3. If I have 2 groups of -3, that's -6. So 2 groups of -3 is -6. 1 group of -3 is -3. So we just saw that in the picture. But what if I have 0 groups of -3? Well, that's just plain old 0. And that's called the multiplicative property of 0. Anything that you multiply by 0 is 0. So after this fact, if we go the other way, if you take away a negative group, so if I take away a -3, that is a +3. If I take away a negative, it's a positive. If I take away 2 negatives, then that's +6. So -2 groups of -3 is a +6. Okay, so our final thing we're going to be practicing today is what happens when we have more than 2 factors. So we know that if we multiply something that has the same sign, we get a positive answer for the product. If we multiply something that has a different sign, we get a negative answer for the product. But this particular question here, we have a -7 times a -5 times a -3. Now, according to the associative property of multiplication, I can multiply these in any order that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to multiply the first 2 numbers together first. So I want you to tell me, what is -7 times -5? Go ahead and answer that for me. Okay, that is actually going to be a negative times a negative, which is going to be a positive. So 7 times 5, and I need to put my pen back on. 7 times 5 is 35. So now we have 35 times -3. So now we have a negative times a positive. 35 positive groups of -3. So multiply a positive times a negative. Will my answer be positive or negative? Answer that question for me. That's right, the answer will be negative. So when I write this problem out, I'm going to say positive 35 times -3. And I'm going to go ahead and write that my answer is going to be negative. So now all I have to do is multiply. So what I want you to do right now is multiply 35 times 3 and come up with a product. Okay, so we have 3 times 5 is 15, and carry the 1. 3 times 3 is 9 plus 1. So the answer you should have come up with is -105.